If you want to do that, let's do it.
Yeah, I get it. I don't know. I'll find a time though.
Okay, so for folks that are joining us on Facebook Live, and I think, are we on recording yet, Tony? For
we are. We're recording.
Zoom, we're all good to go. The professor is thinking about coming out from Colorado. So if you're in California, you've got this huge asset in California. Just call up Professor Tootle and go visit him, or he is an asset to California. There's more than one, but he's like the one. But he's coming to Colorado. So why don't you come and visit the professor and me in Colorado, and we'll do a live show, maybe even as early as on Juneteenth, because that's a kind of a priority of the professors of mine. That's next Saturday. And so if he gets on his motorcycle and comes to visit us, we'll do an impromptu thing down at a brewery, and we'll go for a hike up in the mountains, and we'll talk public policy and politics with Professor Stephen Tootle in Colorado. Wouldn't that be a great privilege? Okay, so Professor, thanks, Frank, and Jake. Professor, wow, every show I say this is just too broad to talk about in a half an hour. And I thought actually elections might be easy enough to put in a cohesive half-hour discussion and do some Q&A on it. But as I'm wont to do, a C student in political science and a C student in law school, I did extensive research. I checked Wikipedia, and I said, hey, history of elections in the United States. And oh my gosh, I got way too much information. I clicked on some other links. But I did, in my mind, cut it into two main prongs this time. And last week was buckets. This one's prongs. I have two premises. One is that Americans don't understand our purpose for existing in America. I've read some of your posts, but it starts with the Declaration of Independence, and it's just enshrined into the rule of law, constitutional republic. And even conservatives say that, liberals say it, and laymen say it. And I'm not convinced now that anyone knows what that's talking about. And yes, I'm talking about what happened in January 6th and how people can say, oh, I believe in the Constitution, or I'm going to fight for it. And I'm going to demand that we stop the count. And it's not Bush v. Gore. I'm going to invade the Capitol. And I'm a patriotic American by doing so. So that's what I thought this show was going to be about. But when I started researching it, I went, well, cool. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator. Beautiful words. But heck, you want to go through dates? 1861 to the 65, the Civil War. 1866, the 14th Amendment. 1869, the 15th Amendment. Hey, Wyoming, good job. Women are allowed to vote. But boy, hey, we beat New Zealand. No, we didn't beat New Zealand because it took till 1920 until women had the right to vote. And I'm not sure what time, you'll tell us this in a second, when blacks across America had an effective right to vote. But it seems like it's in my lifetime.
I always say 1968.
Yeah, but that's in my lifetime. And that pains me to no end when we have these beautiful words enshrined in the Declaration of Independence all the way through the history of the longest serving constitutional republic form of democracy in the world to my lifetime, and they may not have had an effective right to vote. Those are the two main prongs. But we're mentioning women. I guess we can go 21 to 18. Sorry to give you the big picture. Professor, tell us from the start of the country. Everyone before America had the right to vote, right?
No.
So start at the beginning. And then only take a minute or two, and then we'll go to the Constitution or Declaration of Independence Constitution. Start at the beginning.
I think as a kind of broad answer to what you brought up, setting the terms of the discussion, there are kind of two big ideas that I think solve most of the problems that you just brought up. The first is understanding the concept of ordered liberty, which is that in order to be free, it's not just you get to do whatever you want. It's how can you be free in a social setting? How can you be free and live with other human beings? So, and that requires what not just freedom, but usually we kind of simplify it by saying ordered liberty. You we sometimes use the term rule of law, but I think ordered liberty sort of encapsulates rule of law along with the other principles as they're supposed to be enacted. So we're probably need to discuss the history of ordered liberty. And then the next thing, as part of that answer, that will, I think, answer some of the questions you have about the path that freedom took, is to understand that as part of ordered liberty, you have individual rights that need to be protected. And then you have the will of the majority, which still needs to be respected and represented in government. And that means that the views of people who are concerned more with security than liberty are still going to be felt throughout representative government. And when I say security, what that comes down to for human beings is often, I want to protect my own interest against what I see as someone else trying to gain an advantage. Or, so in other words, if you think about, for instance, Black people, you could be against Black people moving into your territory because you're a racist, or you could just simply see it as, I don't want the competition, or you could see it as, this is something that's going to bring slavery, or this is something that is just going to, in some way, affect my quality of life, and I don't like it because it's different. So there are a lot of different reasons that I would put under the, broad heading of just people don't like anything that's different. Security.
Well, so Professor, narrowing it down slightly, I love the big broad picture.
Well, there's one final thing I get that just occurred to me too, and that is the understanding the relationship between culture at the local level, but then also politics at the city, state, county, state, and national level, and how the concept of freedom is experienced differently at different levels of government. So, we talk about, well, Black people couldn't vote. Well, there were times in states where they could vote, and then that went away. We can talk about why. There were places where women could vote, but that wasn't national until 1920. So in other words, the way that our founders set up this system of ordered liberty, it was to filter all of these impulses in a way that it pointed towards freedom, but that meant that you had to represent ideas contrary to the idea of freedom had to be represented. In other words, you got to get everybody to buy into the system of respecting rule of law, even when things don't go your way. So that's why things like what happened in January is so dangerous to the political culture of the United States, because if you simply say to racists, like, we're taking away the right to vote of all racists, well, then they will stop respecting the political system. Not that they do that much anyway, but in other words, as long as people feel like they've bought into the system, then everyone will buy into rule of law. And then if you have a system oriented towards freedom and individual liberty, that's what achieves long-term cultural change. You can't, I guess it's a personal frustration we sometimes feel, especially in the modern age, where we think social change is something that takes place by convincing people who already agree with you to agree with you more. That's not at all, that doesn't change anything. You have to, if you want to achieve social change, you have to get that racist to take the next step. You don't have to get somebody who already agrees with you to agree with you more. So in a way, our system is designed to do that. It's designed to actually achieve long-term social change. And that's why we've seen so much long-term social change. But this might be hard to understand, but under a system of ordered liberty, you have to protect the rights of those people. I mean, that was you know, what Lincoln was saying when he said, you know, the nation can't be half slave, half free, meaning we know where this is going. But Lincoln also said, no, we have to protect the rights of under the Constitution of people who disagree with us. And there was a commenter on one of our discussions who asked about this letter to Horace Greeley, and I think he or she, I don't remember if it was a male or female, thought that this proved that Lincoln didn't support liberty or something. It was like, no, you're reading that document incorrectly. What this document is saying is that Lincoln is personally committed to ending slavery and understanding that the future of the United States is as a free country. But on the other hand, you have to protect the rights of all Americans, and that would include people who disagree with you. So in other words, I guess there are just these different contexts to understand these questions you're asking about the general direction of the United States and how freedom evolves.
Yeah. So, Professor, now we need to narrow, and we need to really narrow. So I have 34 lines on my legal pad here.
Okay.
And I've broken those down into 7 or 8 things that I'd really like to have answered in the next 15 minutes.
Okay.
And that's going to be impossible. So we may do another show or two, depending on your response on each of these. And then we're going to open up to Q&A in 15 minutes. Fair enough?
Yep.
The Electoral College, 1788, right when our Constitution was founded, and still to this day, almost daily, major media talks about the popular vote all the time, like that's the only thing that matters. Well, no, he lost the popular vote. And I do think that's a consideration culturally. But to this day, I don't think people understand how our system of government is set up and why there's an electoral college. So when we're talking about voting in the United States, I think it's fairly unique. I don't think other countries necessarily have an electoral college. I mean, have other versions of it. Can you talk about the importance of the electoral college to the founding / today in 1.5 minutes or less?
Well, we don't. The main thing to understand is that we started out as 13 colonies, and we kind of understood that we were, in the words of some historians, an empire of liberty, meaning at the time we were founded, we were the only free country, and anybody who wanted to live under a free system was going to join the United States. And so we didn't want to have colonies. So if you think about it, like the Electoral College is really designed around the idea of us not having colonies, that we're going to set up a set of rules that say, okay, this is how we're going to go. This is how you can become a part of the United States. And when you go from being a territory to being a state, you're guaranteed a minimum level of representation. And that minimum level of representation is equal status in the Senate, and then based on population in the House. And all of the distortions that people care, they get all up in arms about, it really come from this idea of making sure that states have a minimum level of representation. But I don't know that's my quick answer to the electoral.
That was quick. So let me do a quick 30-second one. So you're from California. Your vote is like so insignificant compared to mine in Colorado. And who cares about mine in Colorado? Go up to Wyoming, just 60 miles north of us. Man, because of those 2 senators, there's way more representation from Wyoming to Colorado to California. That's not fair, Professor. 30 seconds.
You can move if it bothers you that much, but the idea is that elections happen at the state level, and states are in charge of how they allocate their electors. Colorado, when I was there, had one of the dumbest ideas ever, which they thought, oh, we're going to be more important by splitting our electors. And if I remember right, you guys
Two
have,
states do that, I think.
yeah, and it's a dumb idea, because what that effectively does, but the way that what was proposed in Colorado, this would have been, I was there in '04, so, but do you have 7 or 9?
7, we're going to 8.
Okay, so but it was when you had 7, and they were saying we're going to split proportionally, which means that in every election, Colorado, one side was going to get 4 and the other side was going to get 3, which meant that effectively Colorado had 1 electoral vote if that had passed. And I remember thinking, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I've never heard of a state that was willing to take its electoral influence from 7 down to 1. you know, but it was a popular idea back then. I'm glad it didn't pass, because it would have.
It's still popular. I think we're probably in the minority of popular opinion on that. The movement is all the pressure is to get rid of the electoral college, and it simply can't happen because it's enshrined in our Constitution. But let's keep moving.
I mean, but in Colorado is a great example of this. Like, it's like saying that Denver has an outweighed influence in the state of Colorado. Well, you live in Colorado. How important is Denver? Like, how many people live in Denver compared to the rest of the state? Like, I mean, especially now that it all sort of connects on the Front Range, like, there's, of course, it's going to be that way. That's where all the people live. But that doesn't mean that you don't have counties. And for instance, a good example, and a Colorado specific example, but the cost of housing in Weld County is always going to be a lot cheaper. And so because there's less regulation and less taxes up in Weld County. So if you want cheap housing, all those housing developments were right as soon as you cross over to Weld County, it was just nothing but suburbs and houses of people commuting into Denver. So you want to protect the rights of people in different counties to live differently than one another. I mean, that's essentially what's happening in the House and the Senate.
So you thought the last question was hard to answer. This one's impossible. We'll probably do a whole show on this, but just give a tickler. The Civil War. People lost their right to vote. How did that happen? In our Constitution, men, maybe property owners at that time before the 14th Amendment, all of a sudden they succeeded maybe, but wait, they're a different country. No, we never recognized it, but those people didn't get to vote for Lincoln, or what happened on that? Just give us a tickler on the Civil War regarding elections.
Well, again, governments always have the right to modify how you practice your rights when they mix with other people. So if you're talking about Southerners who had their right to vote taken away by this, well, for one thing, there is the way that the United States government chose to interpret that, which if you were to ask a Southerner, they would say, no, we voted to secede. But according to the United States of America, those states never seceded. There was no secession, legally speaking. What we had in the United States, as far as our laws are considered, are a bunch of people not showing up. So when Southerners ceased to send representatives to the United States government, that meant that the president is in charge of ensuring that representative government takes place in all of the United States. So when they ceased to send senators and representatives to Washington, D.C., that gave the president extraordinary powers to reestablish representative government in those areas. So it's a funny thing to think about, but President Lincoln wouldn't have had the legal right to do many of the things that he did in the Civil War if Southerners had continued to participate in the political process. They were the ones who gave him the power to do those things. That's, people sometimes say have this question about the Emancipation Proclamation. Why did the Emancipation Proclamation only apply to the areas that were in rebellion? Because that's the only place where he had that legal authority. Because if they were still loyal to the government, he couldn't act as a dictator, right? It's no different. I mean, the president of the United States is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. Once those areas were in rebellion, that meant that military law was what was functioning there, not civilian law.
So, Professor, this is a different field of study than history with your undergraduate, master, and PhD. But what percentage, just a wrong guess, of the American population understands this last part of the conversation?
Probably
This last 5 minutes, huh?
less than one.
Yeah. And so we should talk about that in future times because I still have 5 more questions. But
Well,
that
a
whole
third of Americans know that we have 3 branches of government.
right. And I'm dropping a seed, planting a seed, and then dropping planting about what happened on January 6th. How, because there's people that say we have a right and an obligation, a patriotic duty to do what we did because there was cheating in the elections. Therefore, it's my constitutional right to listen. So anyway, I'm planting the seed for my final question. 14th Amendment, 1866, worth mentioning, or should we skip to the 15th Amendment?
Both worth mentioning. I mean,
Please take 2
14,
minutes.
15. I mean, essentially, I would say that the founders and the people of the North always understood the Constitution properly. But the argument made by Southerners was that no, you're not understanding the Constitution properly. And you can say that they fought the Civil War over this misunderstanding. What the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment do, especially the 14th and 15th Amendment, is they say, all right, Southerners, okay, Democrats, essentially, you have always made this case that the Declaration is nothing. I mean, that was their legal argument, is that the Declaration is nothing. And in the North, and in Republicans believed that the purpose of the Constitution was to enact the ideals of the Declaration. That was always Lincoln's argument, and it's that was how most Northerners understood it. But in fact, there's a very famous example of this that I give to my students. It's a newspaper editorial, and it actually criticizes the Gettysburg Address. And I always say, okay, here's the Gettysburg Address. Democrats said that this was a partisan speech, and how dare Abraham Lincoln give a partisan speech at a funeral? And they look at the speech and they say, what part of this was partisan? What part did the Democrats disagree with? And even you guys, I can tell what it looks on your faces. You're like, I'm thinking of the Gettysburg Address, and I can't think of which part of it would just enrage Democrats. It was the 7 years ago part. Because only Republicans dated the founding to the Declaration. So when Abraham Lincoln said that our country was founded 87 years ago, that meant 1776. So you think about all these arguments, like this argument about the 1619 project is not new, right? There have always been people who have argued that 1776 was not the real founding of this country. And those people during the Civil War were called Democrats. Their argument was the country was founded in 1789 and that the Declaration was just kind of a nice piece of paper. So yeah, go ahead.
On elections, because Professor, we're going to do a whole show on that because I have a nuanced opinion on that you probably think is naive, which is cool. We'll do a whole new show on that. Regarding elections, keep going on elections with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment.
So the point is that what happened after the Civil War is the national government said, fine, let's settle this once and for all, and we're going to take the principles of the Declaration and put them in the Constitution. So life, liberty, and property are finally in the actual Constitution, which says, okay, we're not going to argue about the history of it. Moving forward, you can't disagree anymore because it's actually in the Constitution now, life, liberty, and property. And
that's a whole new conversation. I'm so thrilled we're doing
who is a citizen too.
Yeah.
So that's the 14th, 15th Amendment.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad we're doing these because that's a whole new topic unto itself. I've only got a couple minutes left. Do we care about the first time that the popular vote didn't Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden, whoever that is? Do we care about that, or does it matter?
I mean, I think it's an important election.
20 seconds.
20 seconds. Number one, that election, you can only say that Rutherford B. Hayes stole that election if you completely forget the fact that no Black people could vote in the South. So in a fair, people always say like Rutherford B. Hayes stole that election. Well, no, he didn't. If your argument is who stole the election, if Black people had been allowed to vote, Hayes would have won in a landslide in both the popular vote and in the Electoral College. It was only through political terrorism that the election was close.
Wow. Okay, that goes right into my, well, two more. Women. It seems, I know, Frank, it's just so much stuff. I get it. Women. It seems like there's a long tortured battle. Wyoming, good for Wyoming. And some other countries a little bit ahead of us. A lot of countries behind us, but since 1920, is it just been golden? Women are 100% full citizens, period. Or no, there's been a tortured history like we've had with Blacks. Get just a minute.
Two things.
I know.
Number one, there's a long evolution of how the franchise operates. Should it be property owners and then to expand it to essentially non-property owners, the next designation was saying all white people.
Right.
And when that happened, women and Black people often lost the right to vote with an expansion of who could vote. So Black people and women and Native Americans could sometimes vote and were considered citizens by their municipalities and their states. But as they said, okay, we're getting rid of the property qualification and we're going away from property, they replaced it by just saying all white men. So that was an expansion of who could vote, not a contraction, but it meant that that Black people and women could vote. The other thing is that culture is always at odds with the Declaration of Independence. You know, it took a long time for science to catch up with the Declaration. So we had a lot of laws that, you know, in the 1960s, for instance, the first laws to make women equal politically and legally, some of the opposition was that no, women had a special status within the law and they are being protected. So there's just a lot of complexity there, because do you want to be a protected status class or do you want to be equal? That is an eternal question within politics. And right now what we have is a kind of mishmash where in some ways we want to protect equality, but in other ways we say, no, these specific groups, we're going to, you know, call them different and give them a different set of rights.
But that does have real world ramifications, including the recent Supreme Court decision about the draft for women. I mean, it's real world stuff.
Well, in a way, I used to say 20 years ago, when I was maybe more optimistic about American culture, that I expected issues of race to go away and issues of gender to not go away because of the biological fact of who can have children and the sort of the permanent biological differences between men and women, versus there's no such thing as race. And if you look at who is what the United States looks like, our culture is already solving our quote unquote race problem through you know, just having babies. In other words, my students 20 years ago would have identified as being a specific ethnicity. And then that, you know, 10 years ago, you had hyphenated names. Now I'm getting quadruple hyphenated names. And students often either reject or check more than one box, or they just say, like, I don't even know how to describe myself anymore. You know, my ethnicity is mixed. So you just like say whatever kind of cooking you grew up with is your ethnicity, but you know, there's no So in other words, we're sort of working on, culture is working its way through that issue anyway.
So Professor, if you'll jump in, if a person just watches this show and not the other 3 shows we've done on race so far, will you give that quote about race and racism?
Yeah, and a new book recommendation too. I just started. So race was a concept invented by racists in order to perpetuate racism, is one of the things I've said. And I've just, I'm about a third of the way through this book called Sapiens, and it's the history of mankind. And it describes the evolution of mankind in the beginning, and it does a really good job of summarizing modern DNA and anthropology in a way that is, in, you know, the guy who wrote it is a historian, so he writes in kind of plain words, but he does a really nice job of describing where human beings come from, and underscoring again that, like, sapiens, what we are just human beings. That and everything else that we put onto each other is just culture. It's to, if I can use the sort of boring academic word, it's a cultural construct, which means it's a thing that we made up. So pretending that human beings are different from each other, or that these differences are significant, has no basis in biology.
So that it's a point well made on science versus culture, Professor, but it also, I feel empathy. I get it. If it's 1869, the 15th Amendment, great. But it took all the way till my lifetime, a year before I was born, the 1965 Civil Rights Act. Whoa, that's a long time to be living with grandparents, great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, people that are alive in my lifetime, to go, great, civil construct, my whole life is ruined. I can't buy you. Yeah, I can't, I'm not a full citizen until my lifetime, really? And then currently, I mean, not just then, it wasn't just like pure in 1965. People are still having problems. So let's go to that for a minute or two, and then I'm going to skip Bush v. Gore, but talk about the 1965 Civil Rights Act, and in relationship to the Supreme Court decision and where we are right now, because we're all irritated at all these states that are putting in regulations, and it's all tied together. So finish us out, and then we'll go to Q&A.
I guess I'll start with a confession of something I used to get wrong all the time. Is when I first started teaching, I would say that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65 were the culmination of the American experience, and that it was when we finally fulfilled the promise of the Declaration. But I certainly have come to see now that I guess I would say in a fuller appreciation of the imperfectibility of mankind, and a fuller appreciation of the system of political pluralism that says that no problem will ever be solved, that the ongoing struggle for liberty is just that, it's ongoing. And that once we, you know, say in law that, you know, everybody can vote. I mean, Eisenhower discovered this in the 1950s, and it seems like every president is always shocked by this. Passing a law doesn't solve a problem. But what it can do is it can point culture. One of the things that Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, one of the smartest things anybody's ever said, was he said there's an essential liberal truth and there's an essential conservative truth. And he was a liberal, but he said the essential conservative truth is that the measure of a civilization is its culture. And this is what conservatives are supposed to be good at pointing out. It doesn't matter if you have a law that says black people can vote if they can't vote. And the Soviet Union had lots of laws that said that, you know, equal rights for this, but they couldn't. And So he's like, that's what conservatives get right. And then he said the essential liberal truth is that politics can change a culture. And I think that liberals are wrong, but there is but there's an element of truth. I think politics can set up the preconditions for a good culture to function, but it cannot create a good culture. Let me put it in another way. Politics can make a culture bad, but it can't make it good. And our system can make it possible for good people to be good and live a good life, but it can't force them. All it can do is create the conditions so that a good culture can take place. So when you talk about Black people voting or not voting, you know, Black people could vote in California in 1960. Once they weren't slaves, Black people often moved to areas where they could practice their political rights. One of the, you know, for instance, if you look at Pennsylvania in 1808, Black people, I think, could still vote. And not only that, they had whole villages of armed Black people where, you know, runaway slaves could go, and after the Fugitive Slave Act, and then the local militia would protect them, you know. So they're voting. They've got their First Amendment right. They've got their Second Amendment right, you know, and that's happening. But or over not too far from me is the colony of Allensworth, which was founded after the Civil War as a place where Black people could migrate to and establish this community out here. And now it's a state park. But in both of those cases, if it's never going to be perfect and it's never going to be uniform, but the system allows, by having multiple liberties that are always protected, it allows these little experiments to take place and take hold. And freedom is such a powerful idea that once it takes hold, it always becomes more successful than the alternative. And that's what, in a larger sense, Lincoln meant when he was saying, like, we can't be half free and half slave. And the South knew it too, because, I mean, every year the North got richer. Every year the North got bigger. Every year more people moved there. Why would any immigrant move to the American South? Forget it. It's not going to happen. And so freedom is so much more, peace and freedom are so much more successful than slavery or the alternatives of peace and of violence. That by protecting multiple liberties in different stages, you know, all the stuff that people say they hate, like the Electoral College, or the fact that cities and state and counties and states have rights along with the federal government, all this stuff that people hate is all the stuff that allows the experimenting to take place and for our culture to change over the long term.
Okay, Professor, I'm sorry to cut you short. I know you want to keep talking, but this is the worst facilitated session I've done because we're already almost a quarter till, 45 minutes in. We didn't even mention Bush v. Gore. We didn't mention layers of government. So sure, we have 50 states and a federal government, but we have 3,006 counties in the United States. We have 19,945 cities. We have 51,296 special districts. So if somebody is going, well, why did you not even talk about 78,000 other layers of government in the United States? I get it. I apologize. But I really want to get to this before we open it up. I have this premise, and remember, I'm the layman. I'm not the expert. You're the expert. I have this premise that it's not just the 500 or 1,000 or however many were in the Capitol, but it's thousands or tens of thousands more. That by supporting those people that were in the Capitol, stopping what the Constitution says is Congress's obligation to certify the election from the states certified and Congress added them up. It's basically a perfunctory result. I have this premise that they are extremely unpatriotic, that it is damaging to our very core of the nation since 1776, enshrined with the Constitution in 1789, that it is a dreadful, I mean, it is it's so inconceivable to me what I was watching on live TV on January 6th. I took 2 days off of work and just stopped what I was doing, shocked that I was alive during something that wasn't just so shut down and so universally disregarded. And I know I'm using lots of words, and so lots of my friends will hate me for this. You're the history professor. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, I don't know if you're necessarily wrong. There are just a lot of different ways of understanding these events. And I don't know if this stuff makes you feel better about America or worse, but remember too that in this country, how many people? We have 320 something
30
million.
million.
330 million people. We got 33 million Americans who are really stupid. I mean, with 33 million Americans don't believe that the moon landing took place. Now they managed to get through every part of their daily life and, you know, whatever, but they can't put it together that that's a silly thing to believe. And every day I still feel comfortable going up to a stoplight and walking in a crosswalk. And, you know, that means that I'm still trusting that person to not hit me when I'm walking in a crosswalk. And the protesters from January seem to have fallen into two broad groups. And in the words of one attorney, he really, I'm sure you can find the link, but he was describing his defendants, but he was just saying, like, these are stupid people. Like, these are the dumb, you know, that, like, these people are so dumb that their defense is going to be, they don't understand anything. And then the Justice Department has separated those people out from the people who were organized, this like Promise Keeper group, you know, that were organizing, acting in a way that was deliberate. So I don't know if this makes you feel better or worse. We are always living in a society full of people who can do harm, people who are evil, people who.
So, Professor, you're answering a different question, though. Thank you. It's not those folks that I'm worried about. Thank you. It's 10 to 20 to 30% of my friends, real friends. These are business people and former elected officials and neighbors of mine, and I truly consider them friends. Probably some family members that say, no, those damn Democrats cheated somehow, and I'm not sure how, and somebody needs to stand up to them. And if it takes violence, I'm willing to, and maybe they didn't send money, maybe they didn't go in a truck, maybe they didn't arm themselves, but they tacitly, if not directly, support the overthrow of the United States. There is no law. I'm telling you, Professor, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, there is no law that allows people to do what they did or support what they did, or to say, oh, sure, maybe that's okay that they tried to do it. It is completely antithetical to the United States. It's what we stand to. Do you think I'm insane? I feel like I'm insane talking to my friends. I don't get it.
Well, you're correct. I mean, somebody needs to mute themselves. I'm getting but I would make a distinction between, there are still reasonable people, and you can, so, I mean, if we're talking about how to take the next step with, if I'm going to take your word for it that these are good people and they just sort of thought about it. Try to make a distinction with them between, are you saying that you wish that these people, that they shouldn't have been allowed to vote, that their votes shouldn't have been counted? Or are you saying that there is some, you believe in some conspiracy or that actually changed the vote count? Because I think that's the next distinction that can be made, is that if it's somebody who actually believes that there's some broader conspiracy, then you can ask questions about, well, how do you think this works? And just keep asking, well, how did this work? But if it's somebody who just simply says, no, I understand, I think that it's unfair that, the rules were changed in this district in Texas to allow for drive-through voting because of the pandemic, and you say, okay, well, but those ballots were, what are you saying we should do with those ballots? And if they say, well, they should be thrown out, well, then you say that's not the remedy. The remedy, and has always been the remedy for cases of questionable ballots, is always to find that person again and let them vote again. So getting people to kind of understand that that if you think that there's something weird about this ballot, that the remedy is to let that person vote again, not to throw their vote out. And I think you can start to make a distinction between people who believe in conspiracy theories that are completely nuts and they just haven't thought it through, versus people who are just simply saying that they wish that those people who voted weren't allowed to vote.
Well, and Professor, and then I'm done for today. It's also to understand that the remedy, the way you appeal to it, is by filing in district court and showing evidence and facts under sworn, and hold your hand up and swear to uphold the Constitution and tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth in front of a judge, and then appellate courts, and eventually the U.S. Supreme Court would decide what the law is, not you or me, or not somebody with a gun, or not somebody who's breaking down something. And that fundamental law, respect across the political spectrum, should be to understand we have three branches on different levels, and we should fight within the system, not try to overthrow the entire system. Anyway, that's my premise. We'll talk about that in a future time. Folks, I'm so sorry to take so long. So I want to always honor Frank because he's the most reliable guy here. Frank, do you have a question?
The significant takeaway from this is that we had a representative government, elected representative government. We limited the number of people that could vote initially because I think we couldn't conceive of just making it a pure democracy.
Well, we've always limited though. I mean, I would say like
exactly. We've always limited.
Even still, we still have rules that say you have to be 18 years old, you have to register X amount of. So to pretend like there's this, oh, it was not limited and then it is. It's always a debate about the limitations. What are those limitations? Yeah.
And all I'm suggesting, and I would ask your opinion about this, is that as we've become more sophisticated in our application of representative democracy, we broaden the number of people that can vote, we're having to figure out how to make it work. It's not, if you made it a pure democracy, I think it's recognized that that would collapse almost immediately. And as we broaden the number of people that can vote, we constantly discuss how to increase the number of people that can and should vote and make that available and make it happen. But at the same time, we're trying to imagine how to allow this experiment to continue to be successful in the face of increasing the number of people who are actually voting. Maybe.
Yeah, but again, I would say like it's not even about necessarily increasing the number of people. And I think about issues that I don't know what the answer is on stuff like this, but if you were to ask me which felons should be allowed to vote again, after which crimes and after, how much time and all that stuff, and, I mean, I haven't really thought through what I think is right on any of that stuff. Or what the process should be, for instance. And but that's I just mean that this stuff is ongoing discussions about what are the methods, how many days before you register to vote should it be, what's fairer, a signature match like we have in California or a photo ID?
Colorado.
Yeah, like in some ways you say, well, a signature match with more, but with more days actually makes it harder than a photo ID. Yeah. So these are all ongoing discussions. And I think demonizing opponents on any of these issues, I mean, I guess some people have ill intent when they're just trying to limit who can vote. But there are a lot of legitimate questions in there about what's better, what's best, where reasonable people can disagree.
But Professor, so we're on the same page on that. The time for that, though, is prior to the election, not after. Is that not correct?
Yeah, absolutely. These arguments that somehow you change the rules, it's like saying, let's go back and relitigate every Super Bowl under the see who would won under, it's like, what? Well, that's ridiculous. Yeah.
Cool. Frank, good enough for now? Okay, thank you. Jeremy, Fourth Estate. Question? You don't have to.
No, I'm just enjoying the conversation right now. So it's a
Glad
lot
you're
of
here.
food for
Catherine.
thought.
Cool. Catherine, you're up.
You're muted.
I came in late, so
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I and I'm sorry I missed
All
the
good.
first part. No, I'm sure that all those people that show, I wanted to thank John for making that point about the insurrection. That's also really reassuring to me to hear people who identify as conservatives be straightforward about saying that was unacceptable. Okay, I can agree there are probably a range of people that just showed up and kind of got caught up in the crowd. And then there were people who were really organized. And I do think that the prosecution of these people is taking those factors into consideration, But John, I was just going to say, the fact that you are seeing people that you respect, this is happening across the country. I've been doing public speaking on this problem of polarizing political speech really since the early 90s, I guess. Everybody's noticing this, that there are people they're having a hard time communicating with because they suddenly seem to be in some different reality, And I just want to say, this happens to educated people as well. They can be really fully indoctrinated. And just to throw out there, at the Nuremberg trials after World War II, half of the people that were on trial there had college degrees. And of those who had university degrees, I think a third to a half of them had PhDs. So people who buy into extremist ideologies can be very highly educated and not necessarily stupid. And, I've talked to people who were rescued, by people with like peasant level educations during World War II. So character, to me I think it can be influenced by education, like we can hope politics and law can influence our character, but there's still something above and beyond these external factors. There is something in our own internal character that helps us, leads us towards truth.
Agreed. Response, Professor?
I just always want to, I try not to ever equate education with wisdom, or character. Yeah. Some of the wisest and highest character people I know don't necessarily have any education, or their education has very little to do with their wisdom or their character. I mean, completely
agree, Dr. Tootle. Now let's go to Juris Dr. Bart Miller.
One thing we did not talk about during this, and it's hard to talk about it because it's such a political thing, is what do you do? One of the problems I'm seeing is that whichever side loses an election seems to want to litigate the outcome of the vote. Physically the number of votes. And you and I, John, we've run for office, and we ran for office back when, people say, oh, you shouldn't harvest votes. Well, when you and I ran for office, there was no mail ballot most of the time. So you were basically harvesting, you weren't like demanding somebody give you their ballot to take it in, but that was a tactic that you would use. If it was more convenient for your neighbor, you would take their ballot and either toss it in a mailbox or give it to the county clerk. But that was
Standard
the way.
operating procedure, Bart. Every one of us would go, hey, Sally, can I pick you up to drive you to the poll? Notice it's 3 o'clock and it closes in 4 hours. Can I drive you there? Of course you're going to harvest that vote.
Right. So well, what I'm getting at is that, like, what's going on in Arizona right now? It seems like the Keystone Cops, you know, they're going to recount all of the votes and make sure they actually, you know, at what point, yeah, I don't know if Professor Tootle has any thoughts on this even, but we've got to get to a point where it's okay to lose an election. And I think people need to understand that, like, 4 years from now, there's going to be another presidential election. You know, another year from now, there's going to be another, you know, elections for Congress and our state legislatures and other local government people. This is, you know, we basically in our society, we take turns holding public office. That's really what we're doing. Elections are the way we decide whose turn it's going to be at that moment to do it. And how do we kind of re-inculcate those values in the public? And maybe I'm naive and we never had those values, but you know, does the professor have any thoughts on any of that?
Well, I mean, I guess in terms of historically, yeah, when the parties first founded, they both considered the other side to be essentially anarchists. I mean, think about the fact that when the Democratic Party took as their name the Democrats, that was initially an insult. That they didn't, calling someone a Democrat was like calling them an anarchist. But when the Democratic Party formed as a party, they took that name on and said, no, we do want more democracy. You know, like they turned an insult into the name of their party. So the acceptance of a kind of opposition, a permanent two-party or opposition party system, you know, came after the Jackson administration. I don't know that there ever was a kind of glory days, but I do worry about long-term political culture. I don't know if that's a good enough answer for you, but I don't know that it was ever perfect. But what you're identifying is that the loudest voices now are voices that are damaging to the political culture. And I don't know if that's because there are more people or if they have a voice. But I think that you know, with the information age that we're in now, what we really need are the two things that we're always lacking are editors and context. You know, and we need better newspaper editors and we need better historians. And it's the two things that our culture seems to be devaluing more than anything else, our editors and historians. But it's the two things that we desperately need the most, because in the job of both historians and newspaper editors is to put this information into context. And because, as Calvin Coolidge said, you know, most lies aren't outright fictions. Most are lies of omission. Clever people, you know, getting back to Catherine's point, you can have a PhD and you can take a bunch of true things, put them in the wrong order, and tell a big lie. You can use small truths in the service of a big lie. And what historians and what editors are supposed to do is make sure that doesn't happen. So not that we're, you know, perfect or anything like that, but you need to, as a culture, you need to value those things, and you need to value those things permanently, so that the long-term result is that you get fewer people who are using small truths in service of big lies. And what we're seeing now, and I think Catherine has identified, is that's the origin of this big lie. Is some of it is a lie, but a lie can seem like the truth if you put a lie with a bunch of small truths. you know. So what really has to happen is we have to have better context for these things.
Which is why we're doing these shows, Professor. Thank you so much for adding that context. We've gone a full hour, but before we draw to a close, Tony and Jake, at least should honor both of you. You're okay, Tony? How about you, Jake?
Yeah, so kind of switching gears a bit. Dr. Tootle, you talked about the For the People Act the other day on the Paper Trail podcast, and how it's kind of one side says that states are enacting voter suppression bills. I think you talked about Texas, and then you were talking about how the For the People Act, House Bill 1, seeks to, reverse that. Do you want to kind of reiterate that and explain that here?
Well, I'm disappointed with the Democrats at the state and national level and in both those things. Because again, in order to put these things in context, you have to have some sort of credibility, and the SB1 would effectively nationalize elections. And again, I think it's something that Bart said about people act like this is going to be the last election we ever have. Democrats, if that was put into effect, what you would effectively do is give more power to President Trump to overturn the results of the election. And you say, like, well, that seems a little short-sighted, Democrats, and then the rhetoric surrounding this Texas bill was completely irresponsible. To say that it was like the new Jim Crow or something is when, it didn't make Texas law any more restrictive than New York state law, in some ways less restrictive. And if you're a quote unquote progressive and you're protesting Texas, but you're not protesting New York, let's just say I don't buy your arguments.
So Professor, that's a worthwhile podcast to listen to. So thanks for bringing it up, Jake. I also listened to it. I don't discount what you're saying, but I also do think that it's disingenuous from the Republicans to say there's fraud in early voting or fraud in these ballot drop boxes, or I'm telling you, we have it in Colorado, and I still have not found anyone to say there's fraud in the ballot drop box or the mail thing or the signature. And it's just really disappointing to me all around. I'm telling you, if there's an elected official that wants to campaign for clerk and recorder or secretary of state or district attorney or attorney general or governor to say, I'm going to make voting harder in Colorado, that's going to be a major point for me voting against them. Not exclusive. It's stupid on both sides. Do you agree or disagree? Am I making a valid point?
Yeah, absolutely. I ran campaigns and I counted votes for many years. And one of the things that, you will encounter fraud, and, we've had close elections in districts that I cared about where the vote, I ran a county supervisor office where it was only 11 votes that separated the two candidates. But in those cases, you just kind of have to accept the results, and when the fraud does take place, I've seen it, I've experienced it. And for instance, once I had a friend whose daughter was in grad school in Colorado, and she was still registered to vote in California, and her mom would fill out her California ballot while she was voting, and that's fraud, and she did it, although her mom did it. So that kind of stuff does happen. But when it happens at a sort of like, at the supervisor level, at a congressional level, anyone who's ever run an election will tell you, yeah, there's fraud, but it's 50 votes out of a congressional district or 100. It's not, I've never had a campaign. The closest I would say where you would say like, this probably did swing it was when Valadao lost one of his congressional campaigns, because that was a congressional district and it was like 87 or 840 something votes. Yeah, that's one where fraud might have swung it. But even still, when we went back and looked at those election results, everybody whose ballot was counted in the surveys afterwards said, no, I did vote. My ballot was harvested, and you can say all that stuff. What we don't know is when they were harvesting ballots, were they throwing out votes that weren't for Valadeo? And there's no way of tracking that really, unless that individual
Well,
voter goes.
but sure, Professor, even that, sure, there's a way to track it. If I voted for Professor Tootle and my vote wasn't counted somewhere, but I turned it in to a person who harvested my vote and it wasn't counted, there's
a way, but I want to be careful here. There's a way for an individual to track it, but there's no way for a third party to track it, because
fair enough.
In most cases, that's a low propensity voter. So you
Fair
can't,
enough.
you can't, I mean, I guess if you were super rich, maybe you could, but,
Right.
It's cost prohibitive to track down that kind of fraud, where you harvest a large number of ballots and maybe a third party group is harvesting a large number of ballots, watching them fill it out and then tossing the ones. That's, you almost can't control. But I guess I'll remind you, when I lived in Ohio, was it any less, Ohio is a big battleground state, still is, but is it any different when the Union white van rolls up in front of your, because, my old professors, they're elderly, but they're all still registered Democrats. And, the white van from Youngstown would roll up and say, hey, it's time for you to go vote. And these guys, Union guys from Youngstown look a little tough, and maybe you're an 85-year-old history professor, and that's voter intimidation. When the guys say, get in the back of my van and I'm going to take you down to vote, I'm just saying this stuff happens at the margins. But overall, our elections are freer and fairer and more accurate than they've ever been at any point in American history.
And in the history of the human race.
Yeah, and I would say, I just don't know enough about election systems in other countries to say this about other countries, but I would say for a large nation of 330 million people, there is no other country as big as us with fairer or freer elections, or with more accurate results.
We're going to end with that. Catherine, I think I've told you before, you're welcome to hang out with us a couple more minutes. We've gone long. I do want to put on this show, though, for anybody that finds this, not in order, but in the next month or 5 or 6 weeks, we're going to be talking abortion. And I know we've already talked to Second Amendment, and we're taking all the controversial issues of the day. We're going to talk abortion, the history of abortion in the United States. We're going to talk about, this is not the right way to say it, but gays, LGBTQ issues, and the history of that in the United States. We're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and there's distinctions and the nuances between the two and why it's more relevant today than ever. And we're going to be talking about the history of the military in the United States. All four, I hope, are good shows. And you're welcome to join us every Friday at 11 o'clock, unless Professor or I are sick or unless we're traveling. Chance that the professor is going to be in Colorado next Friday, Saturday.
It might be in 3 weeks. It'll either be
3 weeks,
or it'll be like 3 weeks from now.
I'm bad with dates. So when he travels out by motorcycle, if he thinks it's safe to do so and he has the time, we might do a live show, and that would be great to have you all with us. So please consider that. Thank you for being with us, Professor. I should give you the last word. Is there anything I missed? I'm sure there's things I missed, but is there a concluding remark that, damn, John, I wish we would have talked about something else?
I guess it's always an underlying thing to remind us of. We discussed race somewhat, and we talked about violence last week, but just understand that everything we said about race and violence applies to discussions of the election. So
I think we under talked, and that's my fault. I agree. I concur with that. Thanks for emphasizing that, Professor. Any other last word? All right. Sure. Appreciate you, Tony. Let's shut us all off and then talk for another minute or two before we